Great, so we'll get started and hopefully, fingers crossed, those online will be able to follow with us. I'll be recording it as well, fingers crossed, so that'll be a way for people to get back. One of the things I'm going to talk about a lot of things, so there might be quite a lot of content. I'll try and keep it as simple as possible, but the fact there's a recording of it means that if there's a particular nutrient you're interested in, you can go back and watch that few minutes on whether it's caffeine or whatever that topic is. So I'll try not to bombard you with too much information. Maybe pay attention to the supplements you think, yeah, I might use that, or I'm already using that. So I've worked in the past with sort of elite swimmers, elite footballers, elite fencers, and combat sports and boxing and sort of endurance was my sort of background, and a bit of support from mixed martial artists and making weight and things like that. So the reason I'm doing this, I was doing a maths degree, and I was as an athlete, I was researching all the textbooks about how do I cut weight for competition, what's the proper diet, and what supplements are beneficial, and that led me to the dark side of sports science. So there's different ways that I'm going to mention some of these. Different ways that supplements can improve our performance. They can either have an acute response where they directly affect how we perform while we're doing particular exercise. But there's also like a chronic effect. If, for instance, they can make us leaner, or they can make us larger, or they can make us train harder, and that way we can accumulate the responses to make us improve our performance. And some supplements work acutely. You take it before your competition and then it works. Other ones can work acutely and chronically, where they can allow you to train harder, which then allows you to perform better. One thing that's a lot of question mark is that what actually is a supplement? And a supplement goes all the way from some of these things here, these pre-workout gels, caffeinated pre-workout gels, or carbohydrates. These are just carbohydrate gels, these ones here. These are supplements. You could even consider like Lucozade or Lucozade sports drinks could be considered a supplement as well. So it goes all the way from that sort of what are nearly whole foods to things like these here. So these creatine tablets. And the idea behind them is that they're ingested purposefully. The purpose of them is to improve your performance or improve your health to allow you to perform better. So there's a lot of different categories, all the way, as I said, from energy drinks, herbal supplements, homeopathic medicines, if that's not a contradictory term, because homeopathy is water, vitamins and minerals, and probiotics, protein powders, mass gainers, all these type of things. These are all different types of supplements, and they're not very regulated. If they were drugs, so the challenge is if they have an effect that is, some of them are drugs, like caffeine is a drug, but they're not regulated in terms of what statements they can make about them. And as we'll see later on, say there are safety issues with some of them. And you don't know which ones have got the safety issues, which is a challenge. So it's a massive market. This is some of the US market alone. So pre-COVID, you're talking about 16, 17 billion pounds. And some of that are sports foods, some of that are sports drinks, but the majority, that big purple bar there, are sports supplements. So COVID had a big impact, but it's probably going to get about 10% per annum increase. So it's quite a profitable industry, and it's quite a growing industry. So when you ask athletes why do they take it, there's a variety of reasons. To correct problems with your diet, like you've got a nutrient deficiency in your diet, so you take supplements to try and correct for it. Convenience, and I think we'll cover later on in a later future talk about proteins. Protein shakes and protein supplements, I think the main rationale behind them is convenience. If you've got to work out and you want to get it in as quickly as possible, it's difficult to get it from whole foods. What I'll do after Christmas is talk about some of the benefits of getting it from whole foods. But one thing you can't deny is that some of these are convenient ways to get, for instance, protein. The word is supplement. So it should be a supplement to your diet. It shouldn't be the main part of your diet. It should be something that's used when it's needed, because they are really expensive. There's a reason why the market is so big and the profits are so high. It's because lots of people buy them and they're expensive. Other reasons they take them are to have a direct benefit in competition. So something like caffeine, you would take that to take a direct. And as I'll mention later on, something called bicarbonate, that would have a direct impact on competition. Other ways it can improve performance are allow you to train better, allow you to recover better, optimize your body mass. So there's some supplements designed to gain mass, some designed to help you lose body fat. Whether they do or not is another question. And another one is to do with injury and illness. So particularly this time of year, inflammation, infection, supplements to reduce that. Other reasons, we're not all Anthony Joshua, but a lot of athletes get them. Some athletes get them for free or get sponsored to sell them to other people. So just because someone in your sport is advertising, doesn't mean that they're actually using it. And so I know from one of my colleagues who used to work at Man United doing the sport nutrition, so they're getting their sponsorship from Lucozade. They actually made their own sports drinks to vary the flavour. They weren't actually drinking this stuff, they were advertising. Just in case, we all think, well, you might be cutting corners with your diet. Just in case, I'll take this supplement because it might improve. And then other people are using them, so why don't I use them? I see my colleagues, my competitors, my friends are using it. That's why I might use it. So this video you'll get, this is a really good video. I'll send the link to it. This is from one of my old supervisors and bosses when I was up at Aberdeen University. I don't think it'll be playable for those people at home, so you'll get it when it's circulated. But it's really talking about the same supplements could work for you, but it mightn't work for you. Depends what your sport is. It depends, in the case of ones like creatine, what is your current status of creatine? If your stores are already full, there's no benefit from taking it. So supplements are very individualized. They'll work in some situations for some people. They won't work for everyone. But there's rough gauges you can go at. If I'm a long distance runner, creatine is likely to be a bad idea as a supplement to choose. So although there's individual responses, if we know what supplements do and the evidence behind them, we can decide, yeah, that's worth taking a chance on, trying it out, or it isn't. And Ron used to have this sort of famous rule about ergogenic aids. If it works, it's banned. But he did tailor that. There may be some exceptions. And we're going to cover a lot of the exceptions in today's talk. One thing, so this one came from something that's worth looking at if you can get your head around this. It's the International Olympic Committee has published an article, a position stand on supplements in sport. This is where they, from 2018, an expert group of people like Ron and Susan, my supervisor, and other people I know, grouped together to decide what's the evidence around all these different supplements. And one of the things they mention in it is anything when you look at science is the hierarchy of evidence. There's all the way down to what my mate says, so anecdote, all the way up to things called meta-analyses and systematic reviews, where you get, in some cases, dozens of articles on a topic. And they balance up overall, what's this showing? What effect does caffeine have on vertical jump or muscular endurance? Let's look at all the studies on that topic and investigate them. Slightly below that are individual trials. So that's called controlled trials. So studies should be controlled, which means mostly means you've got a placebo group in these, and an appropriate placebo. So that can be challenging for some supplements, like caffeine. If you give someone, the first time I was a guinea pig many years ago in university, I didn't drink tea or coffee, and I was a guinea pig for a caffeine study. I could tell I was on caffeine because my hands started shaking after about an hour. So it's difficult to blind stuff like caffeine. Beetroot juice, we'll mention later, turns your wee red and your poo red. So if you're doing studies on that, you can tell it's difficult to blind that you're getting the supplement. than not. So controlled trials are a step down from what we call meta-analyses, because that's a single study. A meta-analysis could be a summary of 20 studies together. What's the overall conclusions? And I'll show you some meta-analysis results just to show you that individual studies can be very up and down, and that's why meta-analysis can help give you a bit of a better idea. For some supplements that are new, there isn't enough studies to be able to do meta-analysis, so it's a bit harder to make a decision. So I'm going to mention some of these ones I've highlighted in the green. There's different ways you can categorize supplements. So the ones I'm going to spend the most on are ones where there's really strong evidence, in some cases 50 years of evidence that they're being effective, if not more. I'll mention briefly about what vitamins and minerals that tend to be low and required supplementation in athletes, which are iron, calcium, and vitamin D. I'll mention a little bit about immune function. It's hard to measure immune function. These are things like coughs and colds and upper respiratory tract infections. What can you do to reduce the risk of those, particularly with COVID and particularly winter this time of year? So I'll mention a few supplements there and what effective they are. Some supplements work in different categories. So creatine can help acutely. So a week of creatine can benefit you in performance a week later. But it could also benefit you by allowing you to train better for maybe weeks or months. And if that can allow you to get stronger or bigger, depending on the sport, that's where you can accumulate those small benefits over time. Other supplements can help you with recovery, particularly ones linked with anti-inflammatory. If you can reduce that soreness you get after training, maybe that allows you to train a bit harder, and so on. Ones I'm not going to mention much on because the only evidence is really protein in both cases. If you're trying to gain mass or lose mass, for gaining mass, the two most important things are calories, getting enough calories in, and getting enough protein in. If you get enough calories in, you generally get enough protein in. And the appropriate strength training if you're looking at gains. If you're looking at losses, there's loads of supplements out there that are sold as fat burners. There's not a lot of evidence that any of them are effective. And some of the ones that are effective, it's because they've got, some cases, banned stimulants like ephedrine in them. Protein is beneficial for weight loss. If you're losing weight, protein can be beneficial in minimizing how much lean mass that you use. But for the rest of them, like chromium, green tea, there's very, very limited evidence. And that won't stop the manufacturers from trying to sell you chromium. So what they use for that is if you're chromium deficient, so chromium is a mineral, it's chrome, it's on your chrome plated stuff, but we need a little bit in our diet. If you're deficient in chromium, your ability to burn fat is reduced. You can't burn as much fat. That is a long way away from eat extra chromium and that will make you burn fat. But that's what a lot of the supplement manufacturers use as evidence. So if you're deficient and you can prevent that deficiency, that might allow you to burn fat. But if your chromium status is fine, extra chromium isn't going to do anything except cost you money in the long run. So fat burners, if they work, there's generally something in them that could get you tested positive. So I'm going to talk through that sort of first category, which are stuff where there's lots of evidence that it is effective and it's been used for centuries, millennia possibly. Caffeine. So caffeine used to be prohibited up till 2004. It's currently monitored. So every year they monitor caffeine in the urine samples, but it's not banned. They're just monitoring it to see that it isn't being abused. But the evidence is lots of athletes take caffeine. And if you're thinking of any supplement, that's one that I think it's not a magic pill, but it's one that's been shown to be effective across a wide variety of different sports over a long time. And as long as you get the doses right, it's definitely worth trying unless you've got ethical issues with using supplementation, where you might think it's not right to use supplements to get an advantage. But caffeine is the one I would think actually there's lots of evidence. You need to make sure you get the right dose, but there's lots of evidence that it's effective. So generally, You take it about 60 minutes before exercise, but it'll depend how long your exercise is, whether you might split the dose up. But most studies, 60 minutes before exercise, because it peaks in the blood after about 45 to 60 minutes. There are very individual responses, so you do need to tailor the dose appropriately. And the doses that seem to be effective, you can get down to as low as 2 milligrams per kilo, which for me would be about 140 milligrams, which would be about a very strong coffee. All the way up to 6 milligrams, which is maybe 3 or 4 coffees, which is quite a lot. One of the challenges in using coffee is loads of studies have shown the amount, even if you go to the same place like Starbucks and buy the same coffee, there's actually a massive variability from week to week in how much caffeine is actually in from the same shop even. And then between shops, there's quite a lot of variability. So it's probably one of the better ways is maybe to use tablets like Pro Plus or powder, where you can minimize the fact that you're going to get a different dose every time you go to the coffee shop. You get cognitive effects at even as low as 1 milligram. So you can tell from even a coffee. I've just had a rubbish packaged coffee there. That's probably about 100 milligrams. That'll definitely be having an effect at 1 milligram, a cognitive effect. I'll probably need to take maybe 2 to have an effect on my performance physically. But they're the sort of doses you're looking at. We used to think, so when I used to box, I hated coffee, but I used to drink coffee to try and lose fat when I was trying to lose weight for competition. We now know that caffeine doesn't really have a significant effect on fat metabolism. It doesn't increase your ability to burn fat. That's what was 20 years ago, that's what we used to think it was. We now know it's mainly on the muscle itself and probably even more to do with the central nervous system. So consistent effects again and again, it alters your feelings of pain and effort. So if you're doing exercise, the exercise feels easier on caffeine. And typically in the labs, we use something called a Borg scale, which goes from 6 to 20. And research time and time again shows it reduces it by about 1 unit consistently. So caffeine alters your perception of effort. It reduces the effort you feel doing the same exercise. And that's shown again and again. It's small but significant increases. So studies have shown, dozens of studies, upper body muscular strength, moderate increases in power output. So that's getting on something like one of these bikes and trying to generate as much power as possible in 30 seconds. Caffeine increases that by maybe 3 to 4%. Middle distance, long distance, lots of studies are done on cycling because it's easy to control. And typically a time trial, which is how long does it take you to complete, say, 40 kilometers on a bike, it improves it by about 3 to 7%. If you're in team sports, there's evidence that it's pretty effective as well. 1 to 8% improvement in your ability to do repeated sprints. This is an interesting one from rugby players where caffeine increased their sprint time, so how quickly they could sprint to do a tackle. It also increased their ability to drive, so the forwards pushing in a scrum could generate greater power. And an interesting one was passing accuracy. So they're passing a rugby ball into a target that was increased with caffeine, which is in the black compared to the white circles there. And that's shown in a lot of team sports. But one thing that's interesting is the expectancy effect. So caffeine, pretty consistent, small but significant improvements in a wide variety of sports. Now, depending on the sport, say your archery was your sport, then that caffeine dose would have to be pretty careful because it's a fine motor control. Too much caffeine could push you over a little bit. And one of the challenges with caffeine is it's got about what's called a half-life of about 3.5 hours. So you take a dose of caffeine, it takes 3.5 hours for it to drop to half of what its peak was. So you're probably not going to overdose with caffeine with a single amount. It's when you keep on topping it up repeatedly that you can get a little bit too much caffeine. But the expectancy effect is a really interesting one that one of our former elite athletes, I don't know if you know Phil Hurst, do you remember Phil Hurst? Who's now at Canterbury, and his PhD and his research now is in the expectancy effect, particularly around caffeine. And he carried out some of the studies while he was here as a student on his master's. So this is the whole idea of believe, achieve, succeed. And this is just one of his studies, which was on well-trained distance runners, and they were running 1,000 meters time trial on 7 occasions. So they did 7 times. And he told them, so CC means, he told them they're on caffeine and he gave them caffeine. And that was their lowest time, which means they ran the fastest. When he gave them when he told them it was caffeine and gave them placebo, they got exactly the same time. So if they believed they were on caffeine, the second one there, they performed equally as well as whether they were actually given the caffeine or not. If they were given caffeine and told it was placebo, they didn't run as fast. And their worst performance is when they were told it's a placebo and they were actually given a placebo. So the actual expectancy that the caffeine will work, and it's the same with any supplement, even if I tell you stuff doesn't work, but you believe that it works, there's fairly strong evidence that it will actually work. If you believe doing this helps my performance, and that's why things like sort of rituals and those sort of superstitions can actually work. Because if you believe in them and you believe this helps my performance, that belief can actually improve your performance. So those people there being given caffeine, when they're told it's a placebo, they don't get that effect, they don't get the response. The dose is pretty important, particularly if you're in one of those fine control sports where that fine control is really important. A lot of the earlier studies were at high doses of caffeine, so the higher the dose of caffeine, the more likely you're going to get some side effects, like dependence, diuresis, which means getting dehydrated from urinating too much. That isn't really a major risk. The caffeine is actually quite a small diuretic. We did a study years ago with rugby players and runners, and we got them to take caffeine out of their diet and take tea, and they actually got more dehydrated because they didn't replace the coffee with fruit juice or water. They just didn't drink as much. So don't worry about your coffee getting dehydrated. It's not particularly a strong diuretic. It can make you feel a bit agitated. Taking it late at night when you're competing or training, you just need to be aware how it's very individual. Some people can have a coffee late at night with no effect. Some people still feel a bit sensitive and don't have coffees after 6. Your stomach can feel a bit irritated when you're doing a big competition anyway. Caffeine can make your gastrointestinal a bit of irritation on top of that there, and a bit of irregular heart rates, higher blood pressure you can get from these. So the dose is really important, and practice is really important. But don't forget that additional stress of competition can mean that you tolerate it quite well in training, but you've got to factor in competition stress can add a little bit onto that. So that's caffeine, lots of evidence. I definitely would recommend people, if they haven't got an ethical issue with using supplements, that it's something that's worth considering using, definitely in training and potentially looking at that for competition. You still get effects from coffee as you do from caffeine, but the benefits of Pro Plus or the powder is that you can be very confident about the dose you're getting. But if it's part of your ritual to have a coffee an hour before competition, and that's part of your practice, there's also the psychological benefits of those habits that you get into. Second one, I think, is lots of evidence that it's effective, but it's fewer sports it's beneficial for will be creatine. So creatine, it can be made from 3 amino acids within the body. It's naturally occurring. It's in the foods that we eat, but it's particularly high in animal products like fish, poultry, red meat. First started to get used, so Britain was one of the leaders in this in the very early 90s, and Linford Christie, who won the 100 meters in 92, he was taking creatine, as was Colin Jackson was taking it as well. Who knows, one of the things they speculate about is, I'll mention one of the side effects of creatine is weight gain. so gaining about 1 kilo, 2 kilos. Potentially if you're a hurdler, have you got enough time to adjust your technique to being 1 to 2 kilos heavier? Who knows if that impacted why you didn't get gold, like Colin Jackson didn't get a gold in that Olympics. The best way of taking it, if you do take it, is as creatine monohydrate. There's loads, it's relatively cheap. Nutritional supplement manufacturers want to make as much profit as possible, so they try and sell things like creatine ethyl ester. You can even get creatine drops. There's no way there's enough creatine in those. You're best sticking with cheap, simple creatine monohydrate. There are responders and non-responders. If your creatine stores are already full, then there's no additional benefit from extra creatine. You can't top it up anymore. And the people who are most likely to benefit from it are those who've got the lowest creatine to start with. So if you're a vegetarian, for instance, it's likely your creatine in your diet will be quite low, and there's you've got a bigger capacity to increase your creatine stores. Whereas if you've got quite a high protein diet to begin with, you probably might have a bigger muscle mass, but you probably might have fairly full creatine stores anyway. So about 1/3 of people don't respond, 2/3 respond, 1/3 don't respond. One of the ways to tell if it's responding is one of the main side effects is you generally gain body mass. About, on average, 1 to 2 kilos. So one of my PhD studies, most of them gained about 1 kilo in a week. I think it was 5 or 6 days, gained 1 kilo in lean mass. And that's one way you know, yes, I am responding because I've put on that much mass. And that mass is a mixture of water retention and some lean mass gains as well. They don't fully know where those gains are coming from. They're pretty consistent. When it first came out, we were worried, what about your kidneys? What about your liver? There's no evidence that it's got any adverse long-term health effects so far. And it's been used fairly well for 30 years now. If you want to increase your stores, so that the normal way is to load for a week, 5 to 7 days at 20 grams per day. Ideally, breaking that up into 4 doses. So 5 grams in the morning, maybe 5 grams at lunch, 5 grams afternoon, 5 grams in the evening for that week, the loading phase. Followed by a maintenance phase, which is quite a low dose, 2, 3, up to 5 grams per day if you're a little bit bigger. Some evidence that having it with carbohydrates, simple carbs, and also even proteins can increase creatine uptake, so increase your creatine muscle uptake as well. So pretty beneficial. What is it beneficial for? It definitely depends on your sport, because that gain in lean mass might or mightn't. If I'm a high jumper, for instance, that gain of 1 to 2 kilos, it could make it harder for me to jump over. It could reduce my jump height. If I'm a distance runner, is that 1 to 2 kilos going to make me faster? Probably not. It's possibly going to slow me down. The benefits are seen particularly in sort of strength, particularly repeated high intensity exercise. So this is a study, one of the early studies here on cycling. They just got people to do 10 reps of, I think they were 5-second sprints. After a week of creatine, they were able to maintain their power output over the 10 sprints. On the placebo, their power output dropped by about 20% over those 10 sprints. So that's probably one of the ways that creatine works best. If you're doing repeated sprints as part of your training, or you're doing repeated sets, you're lifting weights, that's probably where creatine could be quite beneficial, because it allows you to recover. And the mechanism is mainly through something called phosphocreatine. So your muscles use 3 energy systems. The first is called the phosphatin system. The second is called the sort of lactic acid system, and the third is the aerobic system. And creatine works by improving your capacity for generating work anaerobically without lactic acid in it. The chronic results of getting creatine is, we've already mentioned, gains in lean mass and gains in strength and power. Some evidence that's quite interesting in the last maybe 10 years on cognitive performance, that it can actually impact your brain. Probably not much evidence that it's an anti-inflammatory or an antioxidant in it. Some studies show it increase your muscle carbohydrate stores. So overall, it's well established that it works. How it differs from caffeine is that there's a narrower range of sports that it's going to be beneficial for. For team sports, it's likely to be beneficial because you do repeated sprints. Power sports, lots of evidence that it's good. Weight categorized sports, though, you've got to weigh up that 1 to 2 kilos. And there's evidence on people trying to cut weight and being on creatine that it makes it more difficult to cut weight because it gains your mass. It's the opposite of what you're trying to do. So if someone's trying to make a weight category and lose weight for that, creatine is not a good idea because it's going to make it more difficult to lose the weight. So creatine, lots of evidence that it's effective, particularly repeated sprints, short, high-intensity work, strength, and it works through an acute effect, so weaker creatine, but also a training effect. If you can train harder, if you can do more sets, do more reps, that can make you stronger or faster as well. Ones that are a bit more recent that are quite trendy, still quite trendy, is beetroot juice or nitrate. So the nitrates that you get from them are converted into nitrites, and then this ends up in something called nitric oxide, which has got a really key role in things like what's called the vasodilation, the opening of your blood vessels, and also energy metabolism as well. And the beetroot juice is quite interesting in that it increases your efficiency. So studies where they've got people on a bike or on a treadmill and got them to cycle at, say, 200 watts. After beetroot supplementation, they use less oxygen to do that exercise. So their efficiency is increased. Studies have also shown that it increases muscle blood flow as well. So you can increase blood flow to the active muscle. So beetroot juice, quite effective. Some of the earlier studies that showed it wasn't as effective used quite low doses of around what's called 4 millimolar. The evidence is now you probably need between 5 and 9 millimolar, which is about 300 to 500 milligrams of nitrate. And the ways you can get it from your diet. If you eat a lot of green leafy vegetables and you eat a lot of beetroot. But one of the reasons for supplementation is convenience. So that can be like a beetroot shot that are quite expensive, or nitrate powder. So that one there, I think, is a 500 milligram dose in that SIS supplement there. You generally take it 2 to 3 hours before competition. Some studies often do what's called a preloading. So if you remember creatine, you had to do a preload. You don't have to, but a week of preloading is the quickest way to get your creatine up. And then after that, 3 to 5 grams is enough to keep it quite high. Caffeine, you don't do a preload. You just use it acutely before you do the competition. Beetroot juice, you can use it acutely before competition. But there's also some studies showing that if you take it a few days before the competition, that can improve, and you can get even better effects. But obviously that's going to cost you 3 to 5 times as much if you're taking it every day. And some of the studies show that you get less effect in highly trained individuals, and that preloading might be more important in highly trained people than in those who aren't as highly trained. So beetroot juice and nitrate, quite good evidence that it's reasonably effective for some exercise. On this slide here just shows you the difference between exactly the same information and what the manufacturer tells you. So this is from the IOC position stand from 2018, and this on the right is what Beetroot, who sell beetroot juice, say about the same product. So they're using this information here to put that in their advertising. So what the IOC says, you can get 4 to 25% improvement in time to exhaustion. And time to exhaustion tests is where you get someone on a bike usually or on a treadmill, you get them to run at say 8 miles an hour till they fall off, till they get exhausted. And they found 4 to 25% improvement in the studies that investigated that. According to Beat It, they forget about the 4%, they go all the way to up to 25%. So it's like when you go into a shop and you see that sign up to 70% off, and you look around the stuff, and there might be one thing that's 70% off, everything else is 10, 20, 30% off. So that's exactly what they've done here. The scientists have conveyed the variability 4 to 25%. You can get a very, very small effect to quite a big effect. And the manufacturer just wants to get the big effect to put on their brand there. Time trials are more representative of real sport. So if I'm a runner, a better test of whether a supplement's going to work for me, like nitrate, is does it make me run 5 kilometers faster? That's a better test of whether it's going to work, rather than how long can I run at 10 miles an hour? How many minutes will I go? So time trials are more representative of the real sport, because there's no sport really where you just run as fast as you can. You run a distance, where you just run for as long as you can. You generally try and run as fast as you can for a fixed distance, or cycle for a fixed distance, or swim for a fixed distance. So you get smaller benefits when it comes to time trials, but still significant, 1 to 3%. That's a lot smaller, and that's more realistic. The 25% is a particular test and a particular study. So they've obviously gone for the 3%. When it looks at sprint performance in team sports, they found a 3 to 5%. They summarized it as about 3 to 5% improvement in high intensity, sort of repeated sprint performance. If it's less than 12 minutes, there's sort of mixed evidence that beetroot juice is beneficial. It's mainly to do with aerobic metabolism. So 12 minutes is still mainly aerobic, but there's not much evidence that beetroot juice works if your event is less than about 12 minutes. So it could have a training benefit, possibly, but not a competition benefit. But you can see from this, the manufacturers always try and do the hard sell, and they take the stats that support what they're trying to say. Other evidence that's been around for decades, and it works, but isn't very well tolerated, is bicarb loading. So bicarbonate, the idea, your body has natural systems called buffering systems to buffer the hydrogen ions, the acid that your muscles produce. That acid causes pain, and it also causes muscular fatigue. So the idea behind bicarbonate is to make the blood less acidic, to make it more alkaline, so it draws the acid out of the muscle, which means and the lactate, which means you don't get that accumulation of acid and lactate in the muscles. The amount you take is quite a lot, so you need to take, like for instance, 14 to 28 grams of bicarbonate, and that's quite difficult. I'll mention in the next slide, tolerating it is quite difficult. Ron told me before about he was advising a Canadian marathon runner, and they made a decimal mistake, and they were trying to eat 140 grams, or it might have been actually 200 grams of bicarbonate, and couldn't work out why they couldn't take it on. So definitely need to check your calculator when you're doing your calculations. Generally, you take it with either in capsules or you take it with water, because it tastes absolutely horrible. So I tried it before a time trial one time when I was running, when I was in the running club at uni, and I couldn't drink enough of it. So it probably had an ergolytic effect. It probably reduced my performance because I didn't drink enough of it to get enough to make my muscles more alkaline. But I just couldn't drink any more of it because I hated the taste of it. Other ways you can do it are to split the doses, smaller doses, or you can even slowly load over a couple of days. Evidence is really effective in middle distance events like 2 to 8 minutes. So if I was a rower, for instance, there's lots of evidence. For instance, in the top left-hand corner, the men's 8 won the Olympics in 2000 at Sydney, and they were taking bicarb to improve their performance. It's perfect for middle distance events. If you're a middle distance runner or a rower, some sport that's going to be less than 10 minutes long and more than a couple of minutes long. This is a study here where they just got people to do repeated sprints, and in a similar way to creatine, you got less fatigue when they were bicarb loaded. Problems with it is not quite half of people, but most people don't tolerate it well. it reacts with the acid in your stomach to cause carbon dioxide. So you get bubbling in your stomach, which can cause burping, vomiting, cramps, diarrhea, and nausea. So it's not like the other two, where if you get the dose of caffeine wrong, you can feel a bit poorly, not so good. But there's got pretty serious symptoms if you don't tolerate the bicarb very well. So what you can do to try and reduce those risks is have a meal. Sodium citrate rather than sodium bicarbonate is a little bit better tolerated. Split the dose up, and it's very individual. See what works rather than trying it for the first time. I wouldn't like to be in a rowing boat with someone if the person in front of me was having explosive vomiting or diarrhea. Other ones that are, this one is a bit more recent, and maybe in the future it will be more evidence that it's beneficial. It looks like it's got small but meaningful effects. It's called beta-alanine, and it's similar to bicarbonate in terms of it's to do with buffering the acids that your muscles produce when you're doing high intensity exercise. So beta-alanine increases something called carnosine. You need to take quite a lot of beta-alanine, so maybe a couple of grams every few hours, and it takes as much as 3 months of supplementation. So it's one it's not one that you easily try, because it's not like caffeine where I take it an hour later I exercise. This takes months to actually increase in the muscle, and the benefits are probably smaller than caffeine. They're about negligible up to about 3% improvement there's some evidence you can stack it, so you can take bicarb and beta-alanine together. Some studies looking at caffeine and beta-alanine. There's a lot of different, if you stack things together, you need to be really careful because you can get symptoms from bicarb. You don't get the same symptoms from beta-alanine, but yeah, you need to be careful when you stack things together and try. People using steroids, for instance, stack them where they vary the steroids that they're using. You can do something similar with supplements. You can take caffeine and beta-alanine, but you need to be careful about using them. So it's probably it's not an easy choice to choose beta-alanine. 3 to 4 months of supplementation. It's a lot of money to spend for, you don't know how effective it's going to be. So they're the main supplements I'm talking about, where there's lots of evidence that they're pretty effective. In terms of normal foods or normal diet, if you've got a normal diet and you get enough calories, you'll generally get enough vitamins, with the exception of vitamin D that I'll mention in a couple of slides. In terms of minerals, calcium is quite common to be deficient if you're on a restrictive diet. If you're not getting enough calories, if you're avoiding dairy products, you're likely not to get enough calcium in your diet. So one aim is to go for maybe 500 mils a day of a dairy product, like sort of milk or yogurt. There's no overall, so what dairy, the saturated fats that you've got, dairy is a funny one in that what it's made up of in terms of saturated fats, it shouldn't be particularly good for you. But there's something about the dairy matrix, how it's actually delivered, that dairy doesn't have the adverse effects you would expect, given how much saturated fat is in it. Iron is a really interesting one. For most male athletes, it's not an issue at all, but for a huge number of female athletes, it is an issue. Women need twice as much iron as men, and they generally eat less than men because they eat fewer calories on average. What you don't want to do is take mega doses of iron, because too much iron is as bad as not enough iron. But something like a multi-mineral, multivitamin that's got a reasonable amount of iron is not a bad idea, particularly if you're a female athlete. Most cases, your iron deficiency, which is enough to cause anemia, is fairly rare. But iron deficiency, which is enough to cause, say, compromised immune function, is relatively common in females. So it's very few that it's actually low enough to drop the hemoglobin and the red blood cells in your body, which will have a massive effect on performance. That's why athletes take EPO. Some athletes take EPO, take all the risks to do with EPO to boost the red blood cells. You want to make sure that you've got enough iron, particularly for females, to make sure they're not anemic. Anemia is fairly rare. but iron deficiency is really common in females because of the menstrual blood loss. So what you could do is, a multivitamin is not a bad idea. That's got multi-mineral in it, it's moderate amounts of iron. Another thing you can do is, if you have like cereal, like whether it's cornflakes, if you have vitamin C at the same time as the cereal, it increases iron absorption as well. It doesn't increase iron absorption if the iron is from meat, but if it's from like cereal or from foods, like your spinach and your broccoli, vitamin C helps to increase absorption. Vitamin D is really trendy, and it's one of the ones that the more I read about it, the more I've actually fairly religious at taking my vitamin D during the winter months. And the reason why is this graph up on the top. This is the sunlight exposure you get throughout the year from January up to December. And the quality of the light, because of the position of the sun in the winter, even if you're a naturist, for instance, it's just not strong enough to stimulate vitamin D production inside your skin. And the evidence is particularly those from, say, Afro-Caribbean backgrounds or Asian backgrounds, the vitamin D, the melatonin content of the skin reduces how much of vitamin D, the effectiveness of the sun as well. So if you're living in the north of England, and it's even worse in Scotland, vitamin D deficiency is really common. It's very common. Vitamin D is cheap as chips. If you're getting a multivitamin, most multivitamins like this one don't have enough vitamin D in them. So the guidelines are 10 micrograms per day. This has 5 micrograms in it. Your diet has about 2 micrograms. So most people, even taking a multivitamin in the winter, aren't going to be hitting how much they need. Just thinking about COVID, it doesn't protect you from COVID. There's recent research looking at it. Some evidence that it has a small protective effect, but as an athlete, there's reasonable evidence from meta-analyses that it reduces your risk of an upper respiratory tract infection, coughs and colds, by about 10 to 20%. So it's not amazing, but it's a reduction in coughs and colds, which could impact your performance. This is an interesting study here, and you might read a study and think, oh, that looks like vitamin D could be amazing at preventing muscle damage. That was done in rats, though. So you read the study, it looks really interesting, but it's done in rats. So definitely, I think vitamin D has potential benefits in terms of immune function, in terms of infection, and also potentially in terms of recovery, but mostly I think in terms of preventing infections is probably the biggest area that it has. And it's amazing, vitamin D has a role in so many different systems within the body, from reproduction to immune function to muscle and to bone as well. So it's definitely one just to avoid being deficient over the Christmas and spring. So from about October, November, December, January, February, even going into March, it's a good idea to think about supplementing because it's really cheap. So if you do have a multivitamin, multi-mineral, pick one that's got maybe 10 micrograms, which most of them don't. In terms of immune function, vitamin D, small benefits from that. Probiotics, you need quite a large dose, but there's evidence that they are effective for reducing upper respiratory symptoms, coughs and colds and things like that. Vitamin C might reduce that. Carbohydrates can reduce one of your stress hormones. Some of these other ones here, there's fairly limited evidence that they're effective. But there's interesting ones. If you do get a cold, some evidence that zinc lozenges, which quite a lot of zinc, can reduce the severity of the cold. So if you do get a cold coming up to competition, maybe think about those zinc lozenges, because there's quite a few studies showing they can sort of shorten some of the symptoms you get, shorten the length of it. Omega-3s. So like a lot of supplements, if you can get it from your diet, if you eat enough oily fish, that's probably the best way to get it. But if you don't, a pill with a couple of grams of EPA or DHA is not a bad idea. It goes into your cells, into the membrane of the cells, and there's a reasonable amount of evidence that it reduces inflammation and can help muscle repair. It's not a magic bullet. But small evidence, again, similar to vitamin D, can reduce your risk of infections and Evidence that it improves muscle repair was only when people didn't get enough protein. Protein is the most important part of muscle repair and energy. But if you don't get enough protein, some evidence that omega-3s can be beneficial. But it's still pretty early days. But like the best way, if you can get it from your food, that's the best way to get it. It's the same with a lot of the vitamins and minerals. There's more evidence that getting like your intake of like fruit and veg is a better way to get these vitamins and minerals, because often there's other substances in those vegetables, like polyphenols and fruit, that aren't in a tablet, that aren't going to be in one of these. And the benefits of the fiber and the fullness you get from eating fruit and veg as well. Another interesting one the last few years to do with inflammation is something called tart cherry juice. And this is one from someone called Jess Ennis at St. Mary's. This is just published this year. And this is just showing improvements in sprint recovery, and vertical jump recovery from taking tart cherry juice. Some of the way that it's thought to work is by reducing muscle soreness post-exercise. So these studies are a bit artificial. They induce major muscle damage by doing exercise, and they test how quickly your function recovers. And there's a reasonable amount of evidence that that tart cherry juice helps to reduce those symptoms of muscle damage, which means you recover your strength a bit more quickly. More interesting ones, if anyone likes curry, turmeric is a spice which may have an anti-inflammatory effect as well. And some consider whether it could be an option as opposed to non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. But it's not going to be as effective as ibuprofen, but it does have some anti-inflammatory effects. So there's some studies, there's not a huge amount of evidence, there's some studies showing you get reduced muscle soreness by taking quite a large dose of turmeric post-exercise. But early days. This is another one that's to do with weight changes, and this is a weight gain one, and this is called HMB, and it's thought to work by reducing protein breakdown, increasing protein synthesis, which means your muscles, you can repair your muscles better. But there's fairly mixed evidence in trained people. There's a bit more evidence in untrained people that it can increase lean mass. It needs quite a big dose, 3 grams per day. It has a pretty small effect. It's quite expensive. So it's not nearly like as beneficial as something like creatine. Creatine is cheap as chips. If you buy simple creatine monohydrate, it's not expensive. You get reasonable bang for your buck. There's loads of evidence. I probably wouldn't try something like HMB because it's much more expensive. And in this study here, at least, found that it wasn't as effective as creatine. So it wouldn't be something I would go to first. It's expensive and the impacts are fairly small. So the last few slides are what are the risks versus the rewards. There's a risk that's really close to us here. Northumbria, I think it's 4 years ago. This is why your decimal points are pretty good. So it was a second-year sport nutrition lab, and they did the calculations on their phone for how much caffeine to give the students. And they gave two of the students 100 times what they thought. So rather than giving them 0.3 of a gram, which is a teeny tiny amount, they gave them 30 grams of caffeine. And the lethal dose for caffeine is about 18 grams. So half the people who get 18 grams of caffeine will die, can die. And they got massive, I think it was £400,000 fine, big reputational damage. And that's just someone making a mistake, a student making a mistake with their phone in doing the calculations. And yeah, they ended up in hospital, and one of them ended up in dialysis. One of them, I think, vomited most of it out, so wasn't as adversely affected as the other. So that's a risk. You can get the doses wrong, which is pretty serious. We had an issue in the lab here where someone got 10 times the dose. It was a small dose, and they felt really poorly as a consequence, but they didn't have any long-term effects. thankfully. Other ones are like Britain got a silver medal in the Olympics in the 4x100 meters, but CJ Uja, one of them, had a failed drug test for, I think it was for Ostarine, which is a stimulant. And that's still going through the Court of Arbitration for Sport. He's banned at the moment, and he claims that was from a supplement that he was taking. Anyone recognize this guy on the bottom here? It's a 20-year-old photo. Yeah, Pep Guardiola. So 20 years ago, he tested positive for nandrolone, and alongside a few other athletes, like Edgar Davids, and quite a few, from a supplement that they were taking. At the time, he got a 4-month ban, and it was blamed on the sports medic that was looking after him and a few other athletes like Edgar Davids and Laudrup, one of the Laudrup brothers as well. Nowadays, it's something called strict liability. If it's in your blood, if it's in your urine, doesn't matter how it got there, you'll get banned. Greg Rosetsky, someone else who got a positive test for, I think it was nandrolone, which was proven to be from a supplement many years ago, so he got a short ban. There's problems with supplements. Athletes always think more is better. If the guidelines are to take 20 grams per day, I'll take 40 grams per day because I'll get a bigger effect, or I'm bigger than the average person. Some of these, like iron, zinc, vitamin E, mega doses are worse than being deficient. They impair immune function themselves. Major issues are, though, lots of evidence that what's on the label isn't always what's in the product. And sometimes that's accidental. Sometimes the supplements are made in the same factories as things like ephedrine and illegal drugs that are made, or not illegal, but prohibited drugs in the same factory. And one of my friends works at Loughborough and did some studies on nandrolone, and the amounts that you needed to take were in the absolute micrograms. You wouldn't be able to see how much. So the contamination is a real risk in some of these places if they're making like prohibited stuff in the same place as normal supplements. And now we've got a strict liability policy. In the olden days, you could get away with, you could prove it came from somewhere. We all know about Tyson Fury's boar meat. That was where he claims, I think it was a nandrolone test, I think it was, and he claimed it was from this wild boar meat that he was eating. And Canelo, another famous boxer, he had a positive drug test for clenbuterol, which he claims was from, and a few other athletes have claimed, like Mexican, the beef are fed with steroids like clenbuterol. That's where he claims it came from. But nowadays it's a strict liability. Boxing is one of those sports, and a lot of combat sports have got a lot of murky areas where they seem to get away with it. But Olympic sports, it's a 2 to 4 year ban there. Herbal remedies or Chinese medicine, often they can have things like ephedrine in them. So something like ginkgo biloba, which is a commonly sold supplement, that often can have like a prohibited supplement like ephedrine in it. And some of the studies, say 20 years ago, found 20%. So they would take supplements off the web, or they'd buy them from shops, and they found as much as 20% of the supplements had stuff in them that could give it that were prohibited. More recent studies have found that it's a little bit lower. A recent one found 6%, but that's still a bit of a lottery where a lot of supplements can have prohibited things in them. Sometimes it's intentionally. In most cases, it's accidentally. So what can you do? You can choose whether you do. Well, it'll depend on whether you're likely to be tested or not. But if you are likely to be tested, well, you think, well, I can read that's one thing you should do at least, read the label. But not all products list all the ingredients. You still have that contamination risk, which could be between 6 and 20%. And if it's an unreliable source, if it's low-grade ingredients, who knows? The problem with the sort of the safest way to do it is it's the most expensive way to do it. So if you buy a product that's Informed Sport accredited, every batch of that product has been tested for any prohibited substances in it. And if you think about it, that's going to cost an absolute fortune. So that's going to make the supplement really expensive. So they've got informed choice where they maybe once a month test that same supplement, which will probably be a little bit cheaper and a bit safer. Some manufacturers though lie and say they've got informed sport accreditation, which they don't necessarily have on it. So it'll depend on your sport whether it's a real risk to get that positive test or not. But just being a bit careful about what you buy is not a bad idea. And there's a nice video there if you want to look through that there. So I was going to summarize overall before we have a sort of a Q&A is there's lots of evidence that particularly the first 4 of these are effective. Creatine, depending on your sport, if it's repeated sprints, if it's not endurance, if it's short duration. Even team sports, it's likely to be beneficial as long as that 1 to 2 kilo weight gain, which you might get, isn't going to be an adverse thing. Caffeine is one of the few where it seems to impact a broad variety of different sports. And it might just be a matter of individually testing it. If you're an archer, for instance, versus you're a rugby player, the caffeine dose you might need might differ, depending if it's fine motor control or it's more gross movement skills. Bicarbonate is pretty effective if you can tolerate it and if you're sort of a middle distance event where it's going to be beneficial. Nitrates, small benefits. We're probably going up in price. Creatine's cheap, caffeine's cheap, bicarbonate is really cheap. It's just baking soda from the shop. Nitrates, a bit more expensive, and sort of I think it was more than about 12 minutes long, sort of endurance-y type sports. Beta alanine takes 4 months of supplementation, so it's a long term if you think about taking that one there. For a lot of the rest, the evidence is a little bit limited. The word supplement shouldn't mean, it should be a supplement to your diet, it shouldn't be the main part of your diet. And there's a real move when it comes to nutrition to food first approach. So say 10 years ago or 5 years ago, you'd see rugby players knocking back loads of protein shakes. People get really sick, even when they're getting it for free, even when they're getting paid to take them, of just taking supplements all the time. When I was a student, we did a study. There was a runner called, I think he was European champion, called Dougie Walker, who had a positive nandrolone test. And we were trying to simulate what he'd taken to see if we could get a positive nandrolone test. And half of us actually did. I didn't. It's a bit disappointed. Half of us in the lab got a positive nandrolone test from taking the supplements that he had taken and doing exercise for a week. But I just remember, I don't know how he managed to eat any food. The amount of supplements he was on, he was taking 6 grams of vitamin C a day, which is thousands of times the recommended amount. And all the supplements, I was thinking, how do you, never mind the cost of them, how do you eat real food? Because it felt so full eating all these supplements. So food first approach is how sport nutrition has moved. But if there's evidence that it's effective and you tolerate it and you're willing to try it, there's a place for supplements, but it's not to correct problems with your diet. Sort out your diet first, and the rest will work. So I had a student a few years ago who was telling me that he was taking steroids, and he wasn't in great shape at all. He'd admit himself his diet was pretty terrible. Like what you should do, if I wouldn't take steroids, I wouldn't advise taking steroids, but you should at least sort out your training and sort out your diet before you look at a quick fix, whether it's, I wouldn't say the same thing, whether it's steroids or supplement use. Try and look after your training and your diet first, and then use the supplements carefully and with a lot of practice. Key things are just making sure you get enough energy or not too much energy, get the right nutrients, do the right training, and then look after your supplements on top of that. So thanks for your time, and ready for any questions I'll try and answer.